Thanks for joining us for the 5th Annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm Mai Sisla, the Deputy Director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, a Bay Area-based incubator at the Aspen Institute training technologists on how to do policy. I'm pleased to introduce our next session. Before we go on, feel free to check the full summit agenda and bios of all of our speakers at aspencybersummit.org. I also want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations in such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SIGPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. I'm pleased now to turn it over to David Sanger of the New York Times, who will be leading a discussion on the supply chain and emerging technology cyber threats, a subject he's explored in his best-selling book, The Perfect Weapon, and a recent HBO documentary. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Maya, and thank you all for joining with us on this panel. We've got a great group for you here, and I just want to go about introducing them as they pop up on the screen. For this discussion of supply chains, a subject that normally might make most Washington politicians flee until you sort of reframe it as the central core of the US-China competition and competition with others, which is what we're hoping to go explain today. We have with us Samantha Ravich from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, who, of course, was on the Cyber Solarium Commission, still is, which dealt with this topic at great length and with great clarity, I'm glad to say. Joakim Reiter has joined us from Vodafone and is going to talk a little bit about 5G and Huawei and how the US approach to trying to get European countries to ban Huawei, sometimes by threat of cutting them off from intelligence, has resounded in Europe, but we'll also be talking to them about the broader issues. Claire Vishik from Intel, the great chip maker, is sitting right at the midst of all of this because Intel has discovered how difficult it is frequently to go untangle many of these issues. And Diane Rinaldo was the former acting administrator at NTIA and has been working on the Open Radio Access Network, or ORAN, another acronym that would send many Washingtonians fleeing. And that's an effort to go try to get us out of this dependency on Huawei and other such networks by developing an alternative that makes it a lot easier to put together a network with basically open source software. So we're going to be looking forward to Diane walking us through this. Samantha, wonderful to be back with you, and an old friend. And I'm wondering if you could just try to frame this for us. When your report white paper came out, it identified the supply chains as a really critical element of this. In fact, said at one point, put bluntly, in the context of our supply chains for ICT, the United States has a China problem. Over the past 2 decades, China has mobilized state-owned and state-influenced companies to grab a dominant position in markets for several emerging technologies, including for telecommunications equipment. This is no accident, but the result of a concerted strategic effort by the Chinese government to capture these markets through a mix of government-led industrial policy, unfair and deceptive trade practices, including state-led intellectual property theft, and the manipulation of international standards, and you went on at some length. So tell us for a moment, how did we get to this spot? And weren't we the country that was making all this stuff for the supply chain to begin with a few years ago?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you. And David, it's always a pleasure to see you. You're right. We kind of woke up recently, well, some of us maybe earlier, and realized all the things that we thought we had been making for ourselves, that our economy rested upon, that our military rested upon, our safety, our health. A lot of it is actually now made by adversaries and are in supply chains that we may not be able to trust. Right. So just putting it in kind of a more general context, because, and let me say, this is how we talked about it at the Solarium Commission. So for those of you who haven't looked at a report, www.solarium.gov. We had 4 members of Congress on the commission, and 6 outsiders, of whom I was one. We met 30 times over the last year, 2 hours every time. And, you know, we really talked about the hard issues that we're all facing in clear, practical terms, led by our 2 wonderful co-chairs, Senator Angus King and Representative Mike Gallagher, right? So you wake up in the morning, you turn on the lights, you expect the lights to go on, right? You don't think about what is in the supply chain of our bulk power, right? Where are our transformers coming from? You turn on the water, you expect the water to come out. You don't think about the 70,000 water utilities in the United States and where are they getting all of their IT and OT software, right? Your food supply, your medical supply, and then take it to, of course, the military, right? What makes our planes fly? What makes our ships sail? Our satellites to see? Where are the pieces, the components coming from? Can we trust them? Are they real? Are they counterfeit? Do they have open vulnerabilities where malicious software can get in and bring down our planes, our ships, our satellites? That's the way we kind of framed the problem. And it's a huge problem, right? And the solutions are not easy and they're not obvious, but we have to start to take steps towards them. And one of the things that the Solarium focused on, the commission focused on, is to help the thinking move forward on prioritizing what pieces in our supply chain are A, most important, and B, most vulnerable, and C, can we create the minimum viable manufacturing capacity in the United States or an ally nation to substitute for where adversaries or others, untrustworthy partners, may be putting things into our supply chain. So let me just say one more word and then hand it back to you, David. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission came out with its full recommendations, and we shall see. What's going to be in the National Defense Authorization Act. That should be happening hopefully very soon. We believe that there'll be, or I believe there may be up to 20, maybe even more of our recommendations that are in the NDAA. And many of the ones that are in there focus on helping the US government prioritize how to deal with the supply chain threat. Things like the National Cyber Director, things like continuity of the economy planning. So it helps to identify key component products that are critical for our national and economic security. Right? Leverage instruments of capitalism in our markets to ensure minimum viable manufacturing capacity. How do we work with private and public partners and ensure competitiveness? Because as you said, David, there are those actors, specifically China, that are, you know, completely undermining our economic wherewithal in this space. So over the next year, a number of the specific supply chain recommendations out of the commission will also be pushed forward, hopefully into next year's NDAA, the ones that don't get in this year. But we can talk at length about specifics, but that hopefully sets some of the table.
Thank you very much for that, Samantha. One quick question for you along the way. So when you read the Solarium Commission report, and it's lengthy, so pour a drink and settle in with it. It focuses a lot, as you say, on building these alternatives, which we're going to ask Joakim about in just a moment. But during the Trump administration, what we saw more of were the sanctions to try to wall off Huawei and some of these other suppliers. In fact, there were some that came just in the past few days against Chinese semiconductor manufacturers and so forth. how would you assess, where are we in this process? We've seen a lot of walling off. How much in the past 4 years do we see the buildup of this capacity for alternatives that you describe?
I think probably more, obviously, much more needs to be done, on the latter. But in the commission itself, we realized there had to be a shock to the system. We realized that it's such a large topic. It is every piece of our infrastructure that I don't think there was a lot of pushback to the general notion of things like the executive bulk power order. Right now, the details of how do you go about ripping and replacing large parts of our, bulk power grid system, because the parts may have been provided, sold to us by adversaries, gets a little trickier. Who pays? At what pacing? What is the next one down? Do we even have the capability? Which we don't right now. Right, so it is, as you said, the second part has to be increased at a significant velocity.
So Joakim, as you look at this, particularly from Vodafone's perspective and from Europeans' perspective, and you think about how the Trump administration went about dealing with the Huawei problem. I traveled with Secretary Pompeo when he took that big trip through Europe, and he basically went country to country, and he said, here's your choice. You can unsign Huawei or refuse to sign up, or you can kiss goodbye to US intelligence. And as you can imagine, there was a bit of a reaction, a negative reaction to being presented with that ultimatum. But what's happened in the past 6 months or so is I think I've detected a bit of a change in Europe. The British, having done a sort of halfway measure, then suddenly did a bigger ban. It's still being debated in Germany. Tell us a little bit about what worked and what didn't in the Trump administration's approach as we think about handing this problem to a new administration.
First to say, I like the lot what Samantha said. I mean, I think frankly, telco is sort of the first guinea pig between Western allied countries on how do you address the fundamental questions around supply chain. Vodafone's and much of Europe's starting point is not really about this being the problem of the supply chain being global. Actually, the problem is a different one, and which is the reason why it becomes so intractable. The problem with the supply chain is way too narrow and it lacks optionality. And when a supply chain is narrow and lacks optionality, you can make a point around security, but you're then faced with a resilience problem as a result of the security measures you take, which for critical national infrastructure is absolutely essential. No point in having something where the equipment in the network is secure, but the whole network is not resilient anymore. So I think for Europe, that has been the big conundrum. How do you move up on your security objectives, which Europe shares, while at the same time try to address the resilience effects it will have for the network? And the bottom line, the real problem here is we've been all sleeping at the wheels, ending up in a situation where China dominates more than 50% of the supply chain within telco equipment. And operators have been complaining around this for a long time, saying, guys, the collapse of the vendor space, as we call it, is not healthy. It will not lead to a good situation. I think that for me, the real point I want to land is US have approached this directly as a tactical issue. And that's where you get into a zero-sum game between what you call in the title openness, innovation, or global value chains versus geopolitics. I don't detect any different point of view in a European context with respect to its concerns around China or its concerns around China dominance in technology. But Europe cannot handle a tactical choice because A, it's not a tactical question, but more importantly, it's in a conundrum where it doesn't have 4 to 6 or whatever percent you have in rural carriers of Huawei equipment. It has 30, 40%, sometimes much more. Some networks are at 100% Huawei in certain member states. So rip and replace is like doing open heart surgery on your existing 4G network where you run the risk of losing 3G and 4G signal just for the purposes of creating a more robust 5G network. And that was basically, that's still the big question. And actually, in fact, the US itself is really trying to deal with that problem. So yes, the direction is clear, but the rural carriers have not been requested to do the rip and replace just yet. They haven't really started. You're still having discussions in Congress on the compensation, much of which is what Europe starts now. So from a Vodafone point of view, where I've engaged extensively with US government, but we're also engaging, of course, in Europe. And what we have pointed to is that actually from an industry point of view, and this is not a Vodafone view, there is a way forward, provided we take a strategic look at it, not a tactical one. And that would imply, number one, we absolutely cannot lose against China on 5G use cases. And use cases are driven by the availability of 5G. So Internet of Things, mobile private networks, all the things that will drive our competitiveness. So agree, US has been pushing this really well. Europe has been way too slow in this 5G deployment. Secondly, that needs to be underpinned by a strategy to drive supply diversity. And that's basically where Open RAN and what Diana will talk about, but something that Vodafone is deploying at scale now, including in Europe. Third, that needs to be underpinned by a broader ambition to protect society. Because as an operator, I don't trust anyone. My starting point for anyone I collaborate with, no matter whether it's Microsoft or Amazon for my cloud solutions in the edge, or whether it's Huawei or Cisco or Intel, in whatever formation, I have a legal obligation to never trust anyone and to make sure that my network is safe. Which basically means that my starting point is, how do I build robust systems? And this is where we have to realize what we're dealing with telco is just the beginning of what we will deal with Internet of Things and everything else, which is the softwareization of our economy, where we don't have the robust systems, risk-based systems, to have standards and certification to ensure that the software that we deploy is safe. And then finally is basically the big unknown today is we got to the security standing partly because we didn't have economic policies that underpinned it. In Europe, there is a reason why security has been deprioritized, which is basically that all policymakers only had one objective, which was maximizing price deflation. Well, you get what you pay for. So if you want security, which is a quality measurement, what is the regulatory economic policies that you need to have in place to underpin the investment in security? And that's the question, which is still sort of everyone wants to park on the side. But that was the thing that drove Ericsson and Nokia to actually make far more money in the United States and China than what they make in Europe. So that's why you see Ericsson being very critical of the Swedish decision on banning Huawei, because it is fearful of retaliation in China, because it makes more money in China than it does in Europe, despite Europe being a massive market, because no one makes money in Europe. So you have to understand how a supply chain works.
Let me just take you from this very good explanation of how the supply chain works to the sort of bigger geopolitical question that came out of here. So earlier this year, we heard Attorney General Barr, of all people, sort of not sort of the one you would normally think of as being in charge of industrial policy in the United States, make a proposal saying, look, the only way out of this, if we're going to go build this, is if we can get Ericsson and Nokia and other European members sort of join up with a significant US maker, including a semiconductor maker, and we'll ask Claire about this in a bit. Intel's name was kicked around, but not the only one kicked around, to basically build a Western consortium, something you can't imagine Attorney General Barr's party, thinking of 20, 25 years ago when they were railing against industrial policy, if we're going to be able to go face this. The European reaction, as I heard it, was like, yeah, right. This is just what Europe's going to go do. Sign up for some American behemoth who will basically absorb our companies and take off. How did this idea land in Europe? What did people think of it? And what do you think its future is in the next couple of years?
I think one of the things that we have discussed a lot with the US administration, US needs to be very, very careful about certain things. Protectionism and intrusive industrial policy has a far more long-standing tradition in Europe than it has in the United States.
Yes.
And the security stance of the United States has inflated demands inside Europe for what they call technology sovereignty and strategic autonomy, which, by the way, is not only against China, it's also against the US. So be very careful for what you wish for. When you cross a line, we'll move away from arguing for facilitating market solutions to politically engineering consortiums. When you cross that line, actually you're just inflating a bunch of traditionalists that exist in a number of other continents to do the same thing. but they're not going to do it in favor of US interests. They're going to do it against US interests just as much as against Chinese interests. So we're a big supporter as Vodafone of building the consortia needed to have a successful Open RAN deployment. We're really keen to get Ericsson and Nokia on board. We're working with all players in the market together with a number of US Open RAN players. That's a market-driven consortia establishment. When politicians start to act God in the marketplace, first, US is not doing it really well, but more importantly, it legitimizes everyone else to do the same. And by the way, they're world champions in this in other continents.
Good point. Diane, Joakim has driven this right down your alleyway here. You've been spending a good deal of time trying to come up with an alternative. Wonderfully named ORAN, is that how you will normally pronounce it?
Our coalition is the Open RAN Policy Coalition, which I've been told that it's a mouthful. So ORAN seems to be the nickname.
You guys may need to get back to the acronym doctor and see what you can do on that. But explain how Open RAN is going to be an alternative to this. And also deal with the critique that, yeah, it's a great idea, but it's going to be a number of years before this is all together. And in the meantime, Huawei is going to be out there building market share that nobody's going to be willing to go rip out by the time you come along.
Great. No, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. So I started working with the coalition in March. We launched in May with 31 companies, and today we sit at 57 companies that spanned the globe in the mobile ecosystem. Our message has resonated well with policymakers around the world because we have a positive message about how can we solve this problem? How can we ensure a more robust and diversified supply chain? And what we're talking when you talk about Open RAN, and at the coalition, as you can imagine, with 57 companies, we stay pretty high level. We are talking about standardizing the interfaces between the subcomponent parts. Now that's the radio, that's the software, that's the hardware. And if you're able to standardize the interfaces, it allows for more of a plug and play model that you can build a network. So I liken it to the old stereo system that I got in the 80s from my parents, where it all you plug together in the back, and if something broke, if I wanted to exchange a part, I couldn't. To the stereo systems that we have today, where you can bring in different component parts, or you can eventually just stream in Spotify, similar to the telecom networks that we have. And what we've seen is a lack of VC money in the telecom industry because it has been a closed system. If you have a great idea for a radio, it's going to be really hard. You only have 5 companies that you can go to sell that radio. And there's a 10-year life cycle on these parts. So, the barrier to entry has been too high. So if you're able to standardize, you're going to drive competition. You're going to allow a lot of these Silicon Valley types, engineers, to start thinking of new ways to invent radio software to perform, in the best that you're going to be able to do for a network. Whether you're building the network in New York City or my small hometown of Rumford, Maine, you want a network that's going to be best for your customers. So I think in our conversation with international policymakers, the message has definitely resonated because nobody wants to go with Huawei. But first and foremost, in my conversation, NTIA and my conversations now, it's cost. If you're talking between picking Huawei or picking somebody else, that could mean the difference between being in the black and being in the red. And if you're going to drive competition, you're going to spur innovation, you're going to bring down the price at the end of the day. So that aspect is also very appealing to people. And no longer will we have these 10-year life cycles. You'll be able to update networks as we move forward. So in 4 years, you decide you want a new radio, you can exchange that part out for something new. So it's going to really change how we look at the Gs. So we will have a 6G moving forward, but it's going to be more of an iterative approach to technology as we can do updates through software and the exchange of component parts.
But would this essentially work, Diane, in the future, if this was successful? You would essentially have a white box that could be from any different manufacturer, and then you would have the software built in. So the idea is that the proprietary switches that Huawei or that its competitors in Europe building would basically over time kind of wither because you had an all software solution?
That's right. And it just allows it to, you're allowed to customize your network better. So whether you're using software, choosing a radio, you're able to build the network that's best suited for your particular needs at that time.
And has Huawei joined your 57 companies?
No, they do not belong. They and they also do not participate in the O-RAN Alliance. They have a closed proprietary system, and they have not expressed interest in going into an open RAN format.
Have they expressed opposition?
We have not heard from them.
Okay. Claire, thank you for your patience as we've been walking through all of this. So in Intel, we've got a company that is both a national champion for the United States, a global producer, one that is as dependent on this complex supply chain as any company on earth, and yet which American officials frequently cite as the solution, the way out of this. So tell us how this looks from inside Intel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Great question, but I want to mention immediately that this problem, the supply chain trustworthiness that we're discussing now, is much bigger than one company, one country, one industry sector. I would like to build on what Joakim, Diane, and Samantha said before. I think the main problem that we are experiencing is that there are at least 3 distinct areas that are fundamental to the solution, but that operate in isolation. Without moving all these pieces together, where they are at least understood by the stakeholders, if not integrated, we cannot achieve a good result. Think about a few examples. You cannot provide sophisticated video services if you don't have sufficient bandwidth. You cannot formulate a great higher education strategy if you don't have a K-12 education system in place. It's a little bit similar for the supply chain. There are at least 3 components that I can see there. One of them is the trade system. The global trade system is ancient. I believe the first trade agreements and restrictions have been evidenced as far away as the ancient Egypt. This system has evolved, but it's not evolving fast enough, not on par with the technology to help realize the potential of having adequate rules, harmonization of these rules, and understanding of the consequences of these rules. The second area that Joakim mentioned also is economics. It's impossible to implement supply chain visions in the current environment when you don't understand and combine with the trade rules the economic consequences of the things that you do, both short-term, long-term, both for one company, one country, one region, and globally. These 2 areas of thought have been very active. You have a lot of literature, a lot of government activity, a lot of policies connected with trade. You talk a lot about economics, especially in conjunction with today's conundrums such as 5G. But it's not very common that you talk about these 2 areas together. Finally, there is technology. As a technologist, it's the easiest area for me to talk about. What we have now is a completely different supply chain, different than it was even 20 years ago. In Europe, in research and funding, supply chains are frequently considered as cyber-physical systems. This is because even though we move physical goods, we move them through the use of electronic channels for ordering, for monitoring, for configuring, and so on. And cyber-physical systems and the vision of their trustworthiness is much more complex. It's not just security. It's not just security and robustness. It's a lot more. It's probably security, privacy, safety, reliability, resilience, robustness, all of which need to be considered together. Now we have a lot of technologies, that are treated completely separately from the supply chain, that answer those questions, that deal with safety, that deal with privacy, that deal with some areas of security, especially integrity, like trusted computing or even blockchain and distributed ledger in some situations. But supply chain seems to exist completely separately from them. What we use in supply chain is a list of rules and approaches that have existed for decades and perhaps 100 years. This needs to be changed. We need to learn how to incorporate at least the integrity parameters that have been developed for ICT into the supply chain organically. Is this going to create trust that we need in the supply chain? Certainly not by itself, but it will help a lot because it will create a lot of the situations where you have evidence of your actions, or you have provable evidence that is submitted either cryptographically or through other means that can help make a determination of how your supply chain is working, how your component has been moving through the supply chain, how your system has been designed. There are very interesting projects that are beginning to emerge to combine supply chain ideas and technology ideas together. One of them is driven by Brookings and Lawfare. Intel has something that's called compute lifecycle assurance that works along the same lines, but it is just the beginning. So I think when we learn how to incorporate technology to provide some of the evidence in the supply chain, when we learn to understand the economics of our decisions and be more flexible with trade rules, we will be halfway through to where it will not be a situation where a country of origin is everything. One company determines how we treat all the other companies. One product is not trusted because of an event 20 years ago. We will have evidence of what is happening, and evidence is a foundation of, harmonized, interoperable technology development. It leads to standards. It leads to mutual understanding.
Well, thank you, Claire. That was great. A question for Samantha and Joakim and Diane as well, or anybody who wants to dive in. But let's start with Samantha on this. Right now, almost all the supply chain issues we've been discussing have basically been hardware ones, right? Are you going to buy the Huawei system? Are you going to rely on Chinese undersea cable? Are you going to pick up those networks? Is Claire and Intel going to be relying on certain foundry or other technologies coming from in hardware form? But increasingly, this is a software problem as well. And, that sort of burst upon Americans with the TikTok dispute earlier this year. For the first time, we had the United States seeking to bar a completely software product out of China, an app that was already on 100 million US cell phones, mostly on the cell phones of our teenagers, but not exclusively on our teenagers. And it raised the question, once you've got this on your cell phone and the app gets updated every week or 2 or 3, and you've got the kind of surveillance of your activity that takes place through the app, because the way TikTok operates, it's by watching your preferences. That seemed to spread the whole supply chain issue into new territory and create some new vulnerabilities, and made people sort of think about it, including some at the White House for the very first time. Samantha, you want to sort of walk us through that? Because I know it's an issue the Solarium discussed at various moments.
Well, yeah, although I kind of would push back that it was, TikTok that made us all aware of the vulnerabilities in
No, I
the
said that made
software
the
supply
public
chain.
aware of it. Yeah.
Right. Although I would
Yeah.
say, and not that anyone suggested there was malicious code or anything in Boeing Supermax, but I like that example because, it had over 10 million lines of code, millions, tens of millions of lines of code from developers all around the world, putting together into a system that, then, people fly in the airplanes. There was a problem with some of that. Nothing had to do with malicious code and being inserted in it. But I mean, that I think drives home a point, I think, better than, TikTok. Granted that there was concerns on that as well. So a couple things. One is there's getting to be between hardware and software, a lot less of distance, right, between these two, especially as I focused, I'm also on the Secretary of Energy's advisory board. And, as we look at grid reliability and water infrastructure reliability, it used to be the phrase that OT and IT, they drank at different bars, right? Well, not so much anymore. So that is one thing I have to say. But in terms of what you're getting at, David, is how do we get our arms around this problem? How do we get our arms around who is making the software, who's writing the code, how is it being farmed out, to a couple developers in Vietnam, and somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Latin America, all getting together on a platform to write our code. Who are they? What are they writing? Are we secure? Are we sure about the code that they're inputting? It is almost too much to bear, right? It is, you start to try to focus on it, and that's why people, if their eyes aren't rolling back in their head, they're putting their hands, they're putting their head down on the table. But I love where Claire was going with this, because there, two things. One, there are new ways to think through and understand what is in your supply chain, what pieces of code are going into what systems, things such as secure ledgers and blockchain, to be able to figure out who's writing what in a piece of software. Right, there are real discoveries, innovations that are coming out there. It is not the black box and the black hole that we can't get our arms around. And so, I really do think that some new things are coming down the pike on that. But the second piece goes to what Joakim had mentioned, and we did focus on this at the Solarium as well. We need to, if this is a word, decomplexify. Is that a word?
It is now.
It is now, right? All right, I'm going to patent it. We have chosen to make things so complicated and build in vulnerabilities, right? Do we need everything to go as fast? Do we need to be? Joakim had said that the cheapest, but the complexity is killing us. And so there's too many decision makers that are now out of the loop on deciding, can I buy this piece of software or that piece of software? They don't even know what's in it. They have no visibility. And this goes for, that little old lady in Peoria has no idea whether she can buy X or Y, what's more secure. We focused on this in the Solarium. We need more things like underwriter labs. We need test beds so that average citizens can know what is more secure in the phone that they're using, or their router. They have no idea. I have no idea. My mom certainly has no idea. But for the decision makers who are doing acquisition at the Pentagon as well. So that was a long-winded way around, to hopefully answering, part of your question, that the software supply chain does not need to be as complex as it is, and we cannot allow it to continue to be as such, because we are literally buying vulnerabilities for ourselves.
Great,
David, if I
Joakim,
may?
I'm gonna turn to you, but I want to make the question more complicated by adding in two questions we've gotten from our audience. And by the way, for those listening in, there is a Q&A function. And while I'm sure we won't get to everything, we'll try to get to some. The first two that came in, Joakim, are actually for you, and they get to this point. One of them asks, since Vodafone has defended the use of Huawei in its networks, saying that you could control the security risk by, keeping Huawei out of the core systems and using it in the radio access network. The question is, do you really still believe that? Can you go forward with Huawei knowing that it's a security risk and knowing what Samantha just said about, trying to keep track of constantly updated millions of lines of code? It's not just the Macs that has got that complex amount. And what have you discovered about Huawei and security risks there that lead you in a very different place to where so many different countries and intelligence agencies have sort of warned of?
I'm not sorry. I think that's the last twist of the question. I don't agree with David. We're UK headquartered, right? So we have spent 10 years with the UK intelligence service to go through line by line of the Huawei code. UK has run a test center for the last 10 years where they had to submit any product that is launched in the UK market, and we go through together with the operators, together with the intelligence community, the entire kit. And it's all software. It's not a hardware. Huawei is not a hardware question. It's a software question. That's where you have the questions around, can they snoop? Can they have a kill switch and the rest of it?
Yeah.
It's in the software, right? And that's why the UK built the capability for the last 10 years. That's why UK, by the way, argued for risk-based approach, because it basically had come to the conclusion. It's also why the UK intelligence community came out with identifying software vulnerabilities while recognizing they're only looking at Huawei. We had a 7-year blackout by a competitor here in the UK because of software vulnerability of another vendor. So it goes to the point you can have software that are inaccurate or not good enough, basically, for running resilient networks, which is a concern we have with a lot of vendors, and that's why we're scrutinizing. Vodafone does 3 separate software tests over and above what we do with the UK government. So it's not like we're sleepwalking, we haven't done anything. What you're seeing now is national security agencies waking up, particularly in Europe, for things that we as an operator have been doing for a very long time. And we welcome them to the club because we actually, and that's why, by the way, we argue that we need to have that type of capabilities in Europe for all vendors. It's just simply too important, the type of network you put in, to not have any controls or any checks of the software going into it. But my point is, guess what? The braking system of a Tesla is not determined by the hardware. It's determined by the software. So you're going to have the same questions now that we have on network equipment being spread to all aspects of any connected product in the future. Any product that is running on its functionality based on software. And that's why we, from a Vodafone point of view, said, well, hang on a second. Our learning from network equipment that we've done for 10 years, looking at software, testing its robustness, testing its resilience, looking for software glitches, we're now deploying into our IoT framework where we have a global platform, because that's the next thing. And we're arguing that governments need to quickly build their governance systems to have the capability of checking where the software is safe. I don't use the word security, I use the word safe, because the reality is that we have a full governance system. Every country runs a governance system today to check whether a car is safe, but only for the hardware. When the car is being determined by software, its acceleration, whether you can hack into it, whether you can brake in 60 meters instead of 40 meters or instead of 120 meters, which sort of determines whether pedestrian die, that is no longer determined by the hardware. It's determined by the software. Guess what? Your type approval authorities don't have the capability to check that. I don't think that's a satisfying answer for modern economies when we have a responsibility as governments to protect citizens. It's not a satisfying answer for corporate either. So that's why we're pushing so hard that we need to come together and close this governance gap in the software space. And that goes to Samantha's point and also some of the points made with Claire. So
thank Joakim for making us feel so good about getting into our self-driving cars in the next few years, completely without any run for this. So Diane, let me ask you this. So you've started together this alternative, an alliance, and having the companies together is a proven way to begin to get that going. But you could argue that the US is going to have to need to adjust its industrial policy, or really sort of create one. That's a politically charged word in Washington, although I would argue less politically charged than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So what is it that you would advise the Biden administration to do along that regard in order to speed this along? And tell me, while I know you're working on Open RAN right now, what other technologies, a good question for Claire as well, do you think we should be thinking about after we're done with this telecom question and so forth? And I'm going to ask you both to be pretty economical in your answers, because astoundingly, we are running up against our time.
Great. So if I was giving advice to the incoming administration, similar to what Samantha did in the Solarium report, I would suggest that he brings together the brightest minds in the business to have a conversation about these issues. And you really need to look at it holistically, where you can focus on a single issue, go down in the weeds, kind of figure out where the pain points are, what we need to do, but then pop up, see it at a 50,000 foot level and see if it works in practice. And I think that's really important. You need a whole government approach when you're talking about the supply chain. At the coalition, we focus narrowly on the radio access network. We're not trying to boil the ocean. Our message is simple. We need a robust, diverse supply chain, and we believe by standardizing the interfaces that you're going to allow for that competition to occur and to ensure a supply not only for 5G but 6G and beyond. They were able to continue to have a secure and a robust network that's going to power, as they say, it's the digital of everything that we're moving to with IoT and smart cities and autonomous vehicles. So I think it's important that we have that peace of mind from a national security standpoint, of course, but also from an economic standpoint. It's not enough to take two players out of the market. You need to ensure that the market is healthy and robust as well.
And Claire, could you take up for us the question of what technologies we should be thinking about next that are going to have this problem?
Let me start with what technologies we should think about it next. This is an easy question. None of the technologies that are taking front pages today, 5G, artificial intelligence, and so on, would not be possible without advances in computing infrastructure, computing power, storage, memory, network, plentiful bandwidth, and so on. This is really the foundation of everything. If you look at how this has developed, machine learning, for instance, is 35 years old as an idea. It was prospering in the 1990s, but because there wasn't sufficient computing power, in addition to, of course, other deficiency, it didn't come to its prime time. Think about everything else. Think about cloud, think about modern networking and the idea of intelligent network, sort of looking at the ages as well as the foundation that was put forward more than 20 years ago. And now it is becoming possible with IoT, with 5G, and so on. So, in order to continue on this path, this has to be the primary investment in computing power, in battery power, in storage, in energy efficiency, in network technologies, in international standards that make all this work together. After this, the brilliant ideas that we have in a number of startups, larger companies, universities can come to fruition. We don't have time to talk about them in detail, but investing in the foundation is the most important part.
Very good. Well, we have just about expired our time here. We're right up against it. If any of the four of you have something that is urgent that you feel that we did not get out there, just let me know and we'll give you a 1-minute intervention here.
I guess I would just end with something we can all think about from the economist Joseph Schumpeter, who, by the way, was my thesis advisor's thesis advisor. So I guess he was my grand thesis advisor. And he said that the gale of creative destruction describes the process of industrial mutation that continually revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. And that is really how we have to think about, we have to change how we think about supply chain, and it will involve creative destruction.
Well, it's also a reminder to us that all of us who haven't read Schumpeter since we got out of college, which for me is longer ago than I would want to admit, have to go back and either read that or Samantha's thesis. Those are the only two choices. I want to thank you all for a really great conversation in which I think I know I learned a lot, and we really got a chance to go illuminate all of this.